It's more complicated than that. These are the words and pretty much also the emphasis that I find myself saying a lot of times at work. And it's a relevant enough sentence for me to say that I needed to also reuse that as a talk title in order to explain you the work that I do that I call exploratory testing. Hello, I am Maaret, I am a tester, and I've been a tester for 25 years. I've also used other labels to describe myself, just to avoid some of the misunderstandings around what testers are. I'm also a polyglot programmer. I'm also a manager. But I do gravitate towards the enjoyment of looking at an application, having it be my external imagination and kind of whispering to me where the problems might lie, and helping my product development teams in that role build the best possible products that we can. I have skills, I do have skills in being in multiple different kinds of roles, and I could be volunteering for all kinds of work within my team, but my time isn't endless. It's barely sufficient to do the work that I'm supposed to do as a tester. And even after 25 years, I am not done learning about how do we actually insightfully find all the different kinds of problems, because it's always more complicated than that. My work as a tester, or pretty much anyone's work when they are doing testing in the team, is to go after someone else and find some of what the others may have missed. The someone else might be you yesterday if you are testing your own thing, or it might be some other developer in the team. It might be a different team that you're interfacing with. But the assignment of testing is pretty much always this. You're supposed to find something that others may have missed so far. You're supposed to find new information. And there is never an answer key to all the bugs. There's this amoeba of a system, a lot of unknowns, some of the things we think we know, but we have no answer key to all of the bugs that if you report these bugs, you're going to be doing a good job in that case. We have various kinds of taxonomies available in the field that we can go and consult, but none of them will specifically tell what's going wrong with our application. So it's always kind of like a puzzle, a little bit of an investigation to figure out what things we have already done and what is still valuable to do. One of those examples of doing something on top of things that have already been done is this quote that I put here on this very same slide from a developer whose application I was testing. He mentioned in a podcast interview exactly these words, that it was all written test first. Actually, also it was written in a pair programming fashion, and it was code that they were very proud of. And I went in, spent some time on it, and basically destroyed it in like an hour and a half. Well, it wasn't really an hour and a half. I would think I spent more like 4 hours with that application. I did some interviewing to understand from the developer what is kind of like a listing of all the capabilities he thinks you can do with that application, because that didn't exist in documentation. I took a look at some of the documentation that was created to understand what I could get from there. I set up a test environment that was realistic and spent some time exploring the functionalities like I would imagine a beginner user just would, someone who would understand anyway the purpose of the application and have the basic knowledge. The destroying it in like an hour and a half, well, the software was already broken when I got there, so I didn't really destroy it. I destroyed maybe his illusions around the application, so that's what testers do. By providing information, we destroy the illusions that we were holding. And this whole test first pairing, it really creates a strongly held illusion sometimes that it's all there is to look at things. And it's always more complicated than that. So what I want to do with this talk today is to show you 3 examples of test targets and how it was more complicated than first meets the eye. And I hope those examples give you an idea of how you could test with the mindset of it's more complicated than that, and do a better job to provide the results, some of the information that others may have missed, so that you in your teams can do a better job testing overall. So the first application is a login. So you've probably, all of you, I would imagine, have at least run into a login, even if you hadn't had to build one from the scratch. And running into login, you have ended up testing it, at least, unintentionally, by logging into the system. The intention of actually going about and testing, that's what makes it more complicated. So when we go with intention, we can just kind of like start creating some kind of a listing of things we would want to test. And definitely the positive cases, kind of valid data, is something. And then we have all kinds of invalid cases, invalid data that we could also be trying, like varying the passwords, varying the user IDs. And we can create documentation about this in a very detailed manner. I haven't been in a project that has done this detailed manner of documentation for years, but we could be theoretically creating that. This example is from a course that I was teaching in the early 2000s. And right now, if I would write a test case myself to leave behind for documentation that wasn't automated, what I would probably do is just write login, and it could be anything between 4 minutes and 4 hours or 4 days that I could explore around that particular thing. So testing by nature doesn't include the depth of how far we go with our testing. The 4-minute test is a test, the 4-hour test is a test, and the 4-day test is still a test. It's still doing some testing, but we would definitely expect that we have more chances of discovering information we didn't have if we spend a little bit more time. I wouldn't create documentation that style, but I would maybe create documentation in this automation style. So it makes sense to me to think in terms of taking examples from the robot framework community. Writing a login test case, a positive test case that just logs in and make sure that everything is fine after that. And already this positive test case, we can use it over time, continuously. We can use it for various browsers so that we never actually have to manually, so-called, log into some of the browsers to see that the login basic things they work. But obviously it's limited to seeing whatever the computer is capable of seeing. So whatever we are checking with our test case, only that gets checked. But depending on how we think about the risks around the different browsers, it already might be sufficient. And we could also, of course, document on the same level as on the left-hand side. We could document also the negative test cases and run them kind of continuously. These examples around login have been around so long that I have shared them many times before, but it is, again, more complicated than that. There's more than the positive and the negative test cases, even if that's how we often still talk about around the concept that we teach to new people in testing. And when I was last testing login, I needed to do quite many different things around that login. I explored harvesting ideas from within myself, Googling maybe, using previous projects, previous experiences, a listing of possible problems that I might find anywhere online, having conversations with the team. And I only documented not all the ideas that I tried, because we did spend actually weeks testing that login, not hours or minutes, but weeks testing that login. I only mentioned the ones that were successful in discovering information that was new. Complementing functions was this idea where, if you log in, you need to be also logging out, maybe. Well, it did log you out, at least it looked like it, but it only pretended, so you were actually still in the system. Performance, while it did log me in, it took its time, and when combined with concurrency, it really took its time. So adding more people into the system definitely had a major impact on the logging performance. Session lengths kind of related to logging out in many ways, but there were very fascinating symptoms of combining session information on the computer with that login and trying out the next day logging in when you weren't supposed to and seeing problems with that. With security controls, we basically forgot that customers, our users, might be forgetting their passwords, and we needed to address this on the side then of the start of the production. That definitely, yes, passwords are also going to be forgotten, and that the decision we made in not having it available wasn't the right one, even though we did make it. Multiple users had trouble combining with browser functions, and password managers had trouble, and the environment, while it worked in one, it didn't work in the other, and it turned out that it took us multiple different environments before we were able to nail down properly all of the different environmental aspects that we had around that login that needed to be discovered. So I thought, in many ways that having explored all of this stuff, doing exploratory testing with the team and not just taking login at face value of success or positive and negative test cases, we would have done already a good job. But it turns out that looking at production, we didn't yet. So we had some of our automated test cases running, the login test case running as a monitoring case in production over a longer time period. The data retention policy doesn't have all the data available, so I have only a limited time frame that I could take a screenshot from here. And you can see that 97.15 is definitely, at least, well, it's not the level of our internal aspiration of how reliable login should be. And looking at how it really behaves in production, it gave us the extra information around the third-party dependencies that we had around how we implemented login and how we could learn to react to those third-party dependencies in a better way. Even if it wasn't our parts that were failing, the user's experience overall isn't as good as we'd like it to be. But then again, also, this is a system where 97.15 is good enough. So we haven't had a single customer actually complaining about this yet. I would expect that comes with growth of the business on the product rather than an immediate thing. So testing in production is also part of, it's more complicated than that, whatever that we first imagined. So testing for me, it's kind of like this work where you have these tails, you go back to production, you look at things from the customer's point of view, make sure that you have the customer information. They might not talk to you, you might actually need to have some kind of observability functionalities in your products. But going back and looking at those kind of information, that's a relevant part of how you would think around testing in order to provide the results that overall you're trying to get to. So that's one example. The second example that I want to share with you on, it's again more complicated than that, is from a course that I've been creating where the basic idea is that we take a simple application and we try to do testing, the best possible testing on this particular application, to do the best results we can, to leave behind test automation that we can, and just basically do a good sample of what would good testing look like in a project and teaching how to do that. And I call this approach contemporary exploratory testing, basically for the idea that I believe that automation is part of exploratory testing, and I do realize that's not the way everyone else is thinking in terms of exploratory testing. The ePrimer application, it's a very simple application that tells you whether you're writing proper English according to rules of ePrime. And here this screenshot is already from a text that is a really nice an easy sample, one that wasn't given to me when I started exploring this. I needed to kind of figure out what I would want to use as a good example. And this is good example because it actually already has a bug. It illustrates nicely the different functionalities that we have here. So we have the red things, discouraged words. We have the blue things, the possible violations. But it also shows a bug that it doesn't calculate the word count correctly. And what I see when I have tested this with multiple people over the globe in both paired and ensemble settings, I've had some tens of people spending time with me on testing and learning with this application, trying to figure out how we could teach testing and how we could learn testing with this kind of an application. And when we see that bug, it's kind of like a trap a lot of times for the people who are doing testing and seeing that problem, because when you see a bug, it kind of says there's more bugs wherever that bug was. There's a heuristic on that idea, and you might find yourself that an hour later the only thing you've tested is the word count, which is a secondary functionality compared to the purpose of this application, which is to identify the violations against E prime. E prime, rather than just counting words, you have other applications for word counting, so maybe that's not the only thing you should be focusing your attention to. If you start with automation, I call this idea the test automationist gambit. So you open your game with the idea that you're already creating automation while you're exploring from the first moment. It's your way of documenting. It's also your way of extending reach. It helps you track what you've done. So instead of writing those traditional notes of what you've been doing, maybe you can already write your notes in the format of test automation. It works for certain kind of applications better, especially if you have an API that you're exploring, a brilliant way of exploring an API, and a simple application, web application like this also works really nicely on that context. But the algorithm, kind of the idea that if you want to create something where the automation always is able to verify that colorful, multicolored text there, it requires some logic that you need to create. It's not a very complex one, but again, if you think in terms of maybe you had only that hour, it's very easy to use that hour in creating and testing the algorithm. If you click the link first, sometimes I see people doing that, and I find them kind of falling into the trap of test cases. Behind that link, there's plenty of examples of what is E prime, and systematically starting to go through every sample there can easily take your attention for that 1 hour, and anything outside that given specification, you are then completely blind to it. And of course, then the fourth trap that I see people fall to is the trap of test data. This is particularly one that I see testers falling into, professional testers, in the sense that there's this idea of trying all kinds of error scenarios. The negative testing, it's strong in the community for some reason, and it's actually not the most important thing that we need to usually do with the application. That's a bit old-fashioned way of thinking about testing. And then trying all kinds of weird inputs here. It is definitely helping you find all kinds of weird things that might happen, but you might end up with an hour where you don't know anything about the real functionality or any of the problems that anyone really would care for in this application. So I use this as an example just to show that, again, a very simple application, it's again more complicated than that. So even if I give people in the end of the course, I usually give them this listing of all the bugs that we have found by various groups. Still with that answer key to bugs, now it's easy to find them. People can make this comparison of, well, we didn't find this, I didn't consider that. And usually it's about half of these that I see people able to find with this application before they're ready to quit. So our bar for what's good enough, what's results for testing, I find that it's often way too low. So it's always more complicated than that. it's not just the results in this way, it's also results in terms of documentation. We are very easily kind of ready to say that, it's a simple little thing. We don't need to leave any documentation behind. So instead of creating a test strategy in the beginning of the project, when you start testing something, I think of test strategy, the ideas that are guiding my test design, as something that emerge while I'm testing, and I'm at my very best of documenting them by the end of the project. So just a sample for you, and the test cases that I'm running as I am coming up with things that I want to test and I'm finding problems. Maybe I could create already automation that I can also leave behind, even if it guides my focus to certain types of bugs and makes me miss other kinds of bugs. Since it's more complicated than that, it's always more complicated than that. It's not this or that. It's not automation or attended exploratory testing. It is a combination of these two, and we don't need to separate these two activities into two different people unless we have the missing skill in one of these people. And I see a lot of cases now in real life projects where automation people don't know how to test and exploratory testing people don't know how to automate. And contemporary exploratory testing for me means that I am actually actively trying to create people who understand that more complicated than that also includes the idea that we can and we should grow into better professionals in intertwining these activities into a modern approach to exploratory testing. The third example that I put here is from my project right now. So I wanted to just show that this also runs with not just examples in courses. Every single project that I end up with, I could give you a similar example. This is a really simple one where there's a location of an airport that we could configure. If we configured realistic airports like Chicago O'Hare Airport with specific coordinates, with specific precision and negative and positive combinations, we would get a 500 error from the back end and not having a functional system. And when I'm asking other people kind of how to test this, how would they approach this? Unless they use the application as their kind of external imagination, and unless they encourage themselves to use more than a couple of minutes of time on really understanding what is it that we might be missing as information, they miss all the things that are more complicated than that. And we needed to fix actually multiple problems around this as I started changing the defaults and going through the different realistic scenarios that we have in the production. No crap, no error cases, no weird entries, the negative testing as such, because that is really not the most relevant thing for something that only an admin with certain information can go to. But even the positive cases, that's more complicated than first meets the eye, so that we can discover those problems that we needed to and fix them. And maybe we can again have automation left behind that helps kind of understand what we tested and run those tests later again. So all of this leads to this concept of contemporary exploratory testing. And I think in terms of contemporary exploratory testing and resultful testing, because I find that way too often when I look at some of my colleagues and some of the environments they end up working in, where they are somehow encouraged to do not the best job they can, but the quickest job that they can, they turn into these kind of people that are kind of like a clock that is right twice a day. Even a broken clock is right twice a day. So we need to actually spend a little bit more time in thinking in terms of what are the results that we're expected to create, and are we really doing a good enough job as of now with the approaches that we have, and could we try doing something more to at least assess whether the work that we are doing right now is good enough. I would expect resultful testing to include both automation and that kind of attended testing. Attended testing and unattended testing, they support one another. I would really hate to talk about manual testing because there's no such thing as manual testing. I don't really think there's such thing as automated testing either. It's very manual work to create that automation and think in terms of what do I put in that automation. But it's kind of like a design of that elaborate spider web that makes sure that we have that lunch available. And we have that kind of network of noticing and going and attending to things when they might require that because of the changes. There will be holes, and we'll be looking at those holes, we'll be seeing those holes. We'll put some attention specifically to those holes, and we can always go around, especially when you have an ecosystem, a system like this. You can always go around and never hit that network. So looking at it from the perspective of our customers is a relevant thing for us to do. To build that spider web, we are doing resultful testing. We are wanting to catch information with this awareness of coverage. We want both the good results, and we want also those results to be repeatable, because test results are like milk. They get sour really quickly, so we need to be replenishing them. Automation is a non-negotiable in a modern way of doing exploratory testing or testing in general. But we also want to find all the relevant bugs, and we want to make sure that we are aware of opportunity cost, that we are making those choices of where we use our time. And we need to make good choices, good and balanced choices on those aspects. For me, the traditional way of thinking about exploratory testing is this idea that, you separate this maybe automation or manual testing, whichever you want to think in terms of writing and executing test cases. And then there's this thing that you do on top of that. That still exists in many projects. But what I try to do in my own projects, and what I was describing in these examples, is the so-called contemporary way of exploratory testing, where test automation is actually embedded inside this whole work that we're doing. Because what really matters is that when we are doing testing, we go and dig in deeper to find some of the information that others may have missed. And we are supposed to do a good job, and it requires that we are never bored. And we should never be bored, because we are always building new things. We are taking things forward. And with changes, we can find that motivation of go and explore deeper every single change that we are making, kind of following the developers on how they're making their changes, following the environment on how those changes are happening. And what eventually matters is what our customers experience. We want to do resultful testing, and it's always more complicated than that.